And now we're live.
Yeah, how's your work at Banana Republic and Amazon?
I don't know. Couldn't write it.
Yes.
So, Bradley, if you want to take it away?
All right, excellent. So can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, good deal. I'm just going to share my screen here, and then we'll get started looking at some hopefully fun stuff. So the last forum, Jeff presented on React, and so we went over kind of what React does. It's a library related specifically to the DOM, and some of the structure of React components. So what I thought would be cool would be to kind of do a continuation of that and to like kind of do a little bit of a deeper dive, because there seemed to be a pretty good amount of interest in it, and I had just spent a good bit of time learning React. So kind of as a preface, a learning style that I've adopted is kind of what people do with like to do MVC, if you're familiar with that. So every new JavaScript framework or library that comes out, they do a to-do MVC, and of course there's like a bajillion of them because there's that many frameworks. And I don't necessarily like that though, because I feel like it's too simple. So what I have is I have an app that I created when I first got into web development, and I used Knockout. I don't know if any of you have ever used the Knockout library. It's kind of my first intro to data binding between your models and your view. And I was working for a mortgage company, and I wrote an app that will let you create loan profiles, I call them, and you can add single instance extra payments or recurring extra payments. Like, hey, I want to add an extra payment from this month of this year all the way through this month of this year and see what I can save. So I went through that process, and that helps me learn because there's no creativity involved. Like once I wrote the app the first time, from that point on I know exactly what the app's supposed to do, and I just have to replicate it in a new framework. So here's how this is going to go. We're going to go over a quick review about what is React. We're going to go over some of the things that I liked while I was building that, rebuilding, I guess, that app to learn React with. We're going to cover a couple of the components and widgets and kind of the process that I went through to build those. We're also going to talk about things I disliked, and then we'll go to the conclusion, some key takeaways and any Q&A that we have. And if all goes well, you know, maybe some applause or something like that. All right, so React is the library that we talked about last forum, related strictly to the DOM, and it has a one-way data flow. So what that means is that it's a lot different. It's very much different to maybe if you've used Angular or Knockout or a lot of other things out there, where if you just bind it to something and then it changes, it automatically picks it up. It's one way, and so that can get a little tricky, and we'll go through some of that here a little bit later. But that's like the main thing to keep in mind, is that your data flow is one way. And they use two key components, or not components, two key things that each component uses is props and state. Props are things that gets passed into a component, and those are, you essentially can think of them as read-only, which is here again where we see the one-way data flow coming into play. So if you have a parent container and it has some kind of child component, and it's going to pass some things into it, it's passing in those props, but they're read-only. The child container cannot overwrite those properties. And then the child container or component is going to have its own state, and state would be things that you keep track of. For instance, we're going to look at a tab interface here a little bit later, and one of the jobs of the tab is to know, am I selected or not, right? So that's its state. The props that are passed into the tab may be the label, maybe, you know, my size, or a function of what happens if I get clicked on, things like that. But the state is self-maintained. Keys and refs, those are interesting as well. So if you have a repeated list of React components, you're going to want to pass in some keys to, it's essentially what Angular's track by is, but React actually, I believe, did a better job here because they kind of force you to do it. If you create a list of components and you don't assign keys to them, React will actually throw errors in the console saying, hey, you should be doing this. And I think that's pretty good. And then there's refs. Because your data flow is one way, you may need to access some data from a nested component, and what you'll use is refs or RFs, and it'll basically be able to say, okay, I'm here at this parent component and I've got a child component, but I need to know anytime that child component changes. So you can just assign a ref to that child component, and in the context of the parent component, have access to it. And then JSX. JSX is the templating language, I guess we could call it. It's basically how React mixes DOM with JavaScript, and it's got some neat points. And so the things that I like, the first thing is property validation, and like I put OMG this because like this is a big deal to me. One of the things that I always hated about a lot of like jQuery plugins or even Angular directives, if you've ever seen a thing that's written and it has like a configs or an options object, and it's just like, yeah, it's this whole bucket list of just throw whatever the heck you want to in here, and it just seemed like there wasn't a whole lot of structure to a lot of those, and they always really frustrated me because I thought, man, there's got to be a better way. But with React, you can actually validate that the props that are coming in are of a type they're supposed to be, or you could even kind of use like a shape thing where like, hey, it should have some of these properties or something. It's very customizable, it's enforceable, and so if they don't pass in the props that they're supposed to pass in, or if the props look different than they're supposed to look, you can throw errors, and you can basically, it won't silently fail like Angular does, which is good and bad. It'll actually just quit. The whole thing will just break, which is kind of a double-edged sword. It's good in one way because you have a clear point of error, a point of failure, right? But it's bad in other ways because your app just dies. And then I put like ableable because there's like other ables that it is, but we'll look into that later. It's immutable by default, which we talked about in the props. You can't modify those. Common JS modules, React components can be written in a way that you can require them using common JS modules, which I think is awesome. It's one of the things that I wish that we could do with Angular. And so it's also, I always hated, what's the other one, the AMD modules, like the require. Oh, I always thought that was just terrible to work with. So common JS modules are pretty nice. I also like JSX and I like refs, and we'll actually take a deeper look at those here in a little bit. And so there were, in this app, there's actual, specific components and specific widgets that I always try to build. And I feel like that this gives me a firmer grasp of the concepts in the framework or in the technology or the language or whatever it is that I'm rebuilding this app in. And so a few of those things are this. We have tabs, and then in this case we have specialized tabs, which I'll look at that in a minute. We have accordion panels, and then of course we have the classic situation of forms with inputs and validation and submission. So we'll look at tabs first. All right. So now, can everybody see my project here?
Yeah, but the text is a little small.
Is it a little small? Okay, let me, I believe that there is like a presentation mode. Here we go. All right, so is that better?
Yep.
Sweet. Okay. So without getting into kind of the beginning stuff, I guess we'll kind of dive right into a component, and then we'll kind of walk backwards in a second. So the first thing I want to look at is just the way that I've structured the application here. I've got just the source and then scripts. And then I've got a list of all my components. And there's also some mix-ins and services, which we'll look at those in a minute. So components, this is a small app. And so rather than organize by feature, it made more sense here to organize by component. And so that's what I did. And the tab container is one component. And so if you kind of just break down kind of what a tab is, or what a tabbed interface is, it's just simply tabs at the top, tab body underneath the tabs. You know what's selected, and that tab maybe has a different class, and the body, the tab body should show what it's supposed to show for the selected tab. So I mean, it's very, very simple. So the first thing we're going to look at is our container, because this is what's going to hold everything. This is the outermost chunk of the component. So we're just going to get a handle to React.
You change your theme to a white background one, please.
What's that?
Change your theme to a white background one, please, so it's hard to see the text.
Ah, okay. Actually, I think it's here. I forget what the actual theme is.
Try the search at the top.
Yeah, I guess I'll have to. I thought that'd be pretty easy to find. Yeah, I thought it was somewhere else. We'll try that. That's not right.
Well, never mind if it's too difficult.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I haven't actually changed this in like forever, so I don't even remember. Oh, here it is. Scheme. That's what I need. Let's see, which one is it? Cobalt, I think. No. Default. Yeah, that's
Well,
that's not good.
I'm wrong to apply some of those.
Can someone do a presentation on WebStorm? Wasn't that you?
Jody did.
No, Jody. Jody, where's your...
There's like a bug in there. When I can change it, it's light.
Yeah.
I couldn't take it.
Let's change it again.
Let's focus and clicks off of it.
Is that better?
No, not really.
Not particularly.
Okay.
What's warm neon? Nope, we can't hear you, Jody.
They're just like all Americans.
Yeah, they're all. I like the darker themes, and so that's the only ones that I actually downloaded.
Is the default dark?
The contrast there is pretty good.
Is that one better?
It's better enough that we can move on.
It's better enough.
Okay. Sorry about that. I'll look for a lighter background theme. That way, next time. So the tab container is the outermost chunk of the component, and it's going to actually be made up of two components, which is a tab and a tab body. So you can add a display name property when you do React.create class. That's how you do any kind of component. And if you use like a React inspector, which we'll look at in a second, you'll actually see where it has the name, and so it makes debugging easily. If something breaks, it'll include the display name of the component. And here's the prop types. You can tell it, here's the type of properties that I expect. And React has a bunch of built-in prop types, and you can also make your own, which we'll also look at in a bit. And you can also tell whether it's required or not. So this one is react.proptypes.array, which is just an array, and we're saying it's required. All right. And so you can also do a get default props function. So it's just like this whole object here is just the definition object of the component. And I'm trying to remember exactly what Jeff went over last time, that way I don't duplicate it. So if I skip anything that I think we've already gone over and you guys want me to cover it, just tell me, hey, what's that? But we're setting our default property active tab index to 0. And that gives the opportunity that some other thing that wants to create a tab container can specify right up front, hey, whenever you first load up, I want the active tab index to be maybe 2 or 3 or whatever, to have a default selected tab. And so get initial state is going to be how we set the default values on the mutable object, which is our state. So I have an active tab index, and it's going to pull in from the props. Props don't change, state changes. So we have to basically port our props that we care about over to state if we want to monitor changes. And then active tab, we're accepting in an array of tabs, which is what we went over up here. And so the active tab is going to be the one at the index of our active tab index. We can change the tab, which is essentially just going to take in the index that you want, and it's going to verify that you're not passing something bogus like a -1 or a 50 on a tab thing that only has 10 tabs. And then it's going to just update the state. Set the state causes your component to render. And you can also pass in a callback function. So like let's say you have something that happens and it updates the state, and you want to notify something else, maybe another widget, another component, or like an outer context that something changed. If you were to invoke the function and then call setState, it obviously would get the old state. But if you do this.setState and do the callback, it won't call that until all of the state has been mutated appropriately. And then you can call the function, and anything else that is looking at those values will get the updated values. All right, so the meat and potatoes of the component is render. Every time there's a change that happens, the render function is going to be called. Every time, and the change is noted by, again, set state. So anytime that you change your state, you're going to render the component. We're going to map through the tabs, and we're going to establish some class rules. So for an active class, here's the rule that we have to follow. And basically, I'm just going to map through map through the keys there, and then filter them by the ones that are true, whose rule evaluates to true. And we're going to return a tab. A tab is another component, and here's the way that we pass in properties. So if you've worked with Angular Knockout or any other binding library or framework, it's really similar once you get to this point where it's like, hey, I've got this attribute and I want it bound to this value. And you can also pass in click handlers.
Are those case sensitive? Just curious.
Yes. Yeah, they are case sensitive. From what I've seen, yeah. I do believe so. So the components are just JavaScript references. So like this tab, it's just what I've required from my tab.js file. So a lot of I was kind of confused at first because a lot of the examples were showing how that they would have everything like in one file, and I'm like, how in the world do you segregate this? And then it kind of dawned on me that the JSX is just, even though you have an angle bracket here, the JSX is recognizing this is just a pointer to a function. That's all it is. So I was like, oh, that makes sense. And so there's other properties like custom content. That's a property that's not JSX. That is a property that is on the props of the component. And then the class name, that is a JSX property. Instead of class, it's class name. And we're making sure that all of our applied classes are used. And we're grabbing the tab body. And the way that we do that is we know the API of the tab object. So we're passed in an array of tabs. We got the active tab on our state, and we reference its body property, which may be a React element or some other DOM element, or it may be a function that returns what it should be. And here is then we'll invoke that function, of course, if need be. So here is the end result. So we have just a div container, and we have a little nav DOM node, and it's going to contain all of our tabs. Now you could have totally, like in between these curly braces in JSX, could have totally did this whole, and a lot of people do, and I really don't like it because to me it makes the JSX harder to read. But they'll put like this whole map function here, like, yeah, I'm mapping through my tabs, and I'm going to get an actual tab, object, and they'll stick that whole thing right inside of here. And I mean, that's fine, I guess, but it just seems like it makes it hard to read, so I like to separate things out like that. And then we'll have, so we're going to have all the tabs, but we're only going to render one tab body. And so this actually does not do like what some other solutions had all the tabs there and just basically set them to hide or show based on which one was selected. And it just seemed like a lot of extra DOM nodes that were existing that weren't doing anything. Also, I like that we're actually getting the body in real time of the selected tab. That way, if there is some kind of change or some kind of new data that body needs to react to, you don't have to like worry about it not updating. So we're gonna have a tab body element. We're gonna pass it a function of how to go to another tab. So the body is separate from the tabs, and it kind of needs to know, hey, if I want to send somebody to another tab, how do I do that? And so we're going to give it that information. All right, and then the tab is really, like the tab and the tab body are both really, really simple. They just have a render function. I didn't go through doing the property validation on these because it was so simple. And so it's essentially, I'm expecting if you want to have an href on it, you'll pass that through. Otherwise, I'm just going to do a JavaScript. And then we'll have some tab content. If we have custom content in the tab, so like let's say you want to pass in, I don't know, an icon, or you want to pass in some other thing, right? We can do custom content in the tab. Otherwise, we're going to assume that you want it to be an anchor, and it's going to go somewhere, and it's going to have a title, and that's it. So we just have a div, class name of tab, and then also you want to pass in any other class name. So the tab container controls who's active and who's not, and it's going to pass in that to each tab that it creates. And we'll want to basically add that to this, and we'll also add the onClick event. And it adds the onClick event here, and the container, pass that in here. So we have our tab, it has the onClick event, and and it binds the change tab function to the index of that tab. So, for index 1, its function is bound to the index of 1. For 2, it's bound to the index of 2, etc. And then we'll just put the content in the body of the tab. Now for the tab body, it is also extremely small. This one has a little bit more fun involved in it because we're using a React helper called react.children.map. And what you can do here is you can have properties that you want to pass down to something inside the tab, but maybe you don't have access to that. Maybe it's inside of a component and you don't have a way to actually technically get to it. Maybe you need to know some events. So you have a form that's inside of a tab and you want to know on the outside of that form when it was submitted or when something happened. But you don't really have a way necessarily to go down through the whole thing and add event handlers and stuff like that. So what you can do is you can do react.children.map, and it's going to give you all the children elements, and you can clone the elements, adding in new properties. So what we're wanting here is the go to tab. Any tab body is going to be given this go to tab function from the tab container. So if in that form you do something and it's supposed to take you to another tab, maybe you've got a workflow going on, right? And so it goes tab 1, tab 2, tab 3, whatever, something like that. Down inside that tab, it doesn't know anything about the whole tab ecosystem in the body of the tab. So what you do is you pass that along to it, and then inside, whatever's inside of there then has a handle to say, hey, I know I'm supposed to go to a different tab when I'm done. And that's it for the tabs. And then we have a specialized tab, which is a back nav tab view. So those of you that have been working on what I've been working on, you'll recognize this once we look at it in the demo app. And essentially what I wanted to do is I wanted to be able to say, okay, I want a tab container, but I want a specific type of tab container that's going to have as the first tab a back arrow, and it's going to always go back using React Router. And if there's time at the end, we'll get into React Router a little bit, and that'll be pretty interesting. So I created this, and it's going to take in a lot of the same properties as our tab container, because essentially it's going to hook up a tab container with just a little bit more stuff. And so it needs the tabs, your active tab index, your title, the icon classes. So if you want to use like custom icons, or if you just want to use a title that says "Take me back," whatever, back tab body. So if you want the look of a tab interface and it's only got the one tab, which is back, which is something that we've done on different things, then you can do that, and you can say, yeah, the body really has nothing to do with the tab. The tab is just to take you back, but I want this to show up. And then we also have the location fallback. So one interesting thing about the React Router is you can use this notion of mixins. Mixins is just part of React. And you can say, hey, here's these other components, and they have these APIs, and I want to mix those into my object. And so React Router has this navigation mixin. And you can go back, this .go back inside of your component, and the navigation mixin adds that to it. But the interesting thing is that you can actually just say the output of that is just going to be a true or false. Was it able to go back? So if you went to let's say a deep linked URL, and it had this back nav tab view, and you clicked go back, there would be nothing in the history. The history API is essentially what it's looking to go back. There's nothing in the history API for this app, and so it's not going to go anywhere. So you can say, hey, if I didn't go back and I have a location fallback, transition to the location fallback, which is like a crazy simple fallback mechanism that I like really well. So we essentially have the same stuff that we had in the tab container, except here we have the additional tab. So we're going to look at our, let's see. All right, initial state. We're going to define a back tab that's going to take this .props.title, which is going to be defaulted to go back, and then the icon classes, because I'm using Font Awesome here, I've just defaulted those to some Font Awesome classes. And the class name is back tab, and we have some custom content here because we didn't want the tab class to create its own thing. We wanted to make this a little different. That way we could do our own on-click handler and things like that. So we have a custom content here, and for the body, we're actually going to take in whatever back tab body that was passed into us. So it could be nothing, and there could be no body, like if this is actually going to navigate somewhere, or if this, if this has other tabs that are going to show content, or if this is the only tab and you want to show some other content, we're going to go ahead and show that. So we're going to actually just do tabs.slice to get a copy of our tabs from our properties, and we're going to use unshift. So I don't know if you're not familiar with unshift, it's just like it's the opposite of push. If you have an array with 5 items and you do a .push, it's going to add an item to the end. If you have an array of 5 items and you do unshift, it'll actually add it to the beginning of the array, which is where you'd expect, if you're rendering your tabs in the order in which they are in the array, you would expect your tab to go back to be first and not last. And we're just returning the tabs. And so the tab container gets the tabs, and it's going to render those exactly as they're laid out. And we pass in the same properties, active tab index. And here we're using a ref called tab container. And we have our own go to tab by title function that if we ever needed to from this tab, we could actually, you can access your ref. So this .refs.tab container goes to the actual tab container class, and it has a go to tab by title function on it that'll just take in the title, and we'll look for any tab with that title and it'll go to it. And so that's I don't even think I'm actually using this. I think I just put this in here just to show how refs work. So it's pretty handy that you can access without kind of cluttering up the context of one object and another object. You can kind of share a couple things through the refs that it's like, okay, you get access to this, but it's not like added onto your context. You still have to reference it through the object. So kind of composition versus like extending, All right. So any questions on the tab component? All right. So let's look at. Let me start our server here. I'm not a designer, so let me just preface this with that. So this is just going to look very bland and very, very like kind of typical. So we go to our profiles endpoint, and we're going to see that back nav tab view into action. So it's a go back, and then the first selected item was actually index 1, and we have the full tab action. And then also, because there's a 0 state on the lone profile list, it says click here to create a new one. That's actually just going to go to our other tabs. So we took advantage of being able to pass down properties and letting every aspect within a tab container know how to change tabs. So very easily we'll just change tabs. So the next thing that we'll look at is an accordion panel, because that's another easy one to to do. All right. So again, React create class, give it a display name. I'm not going to go through all this because it's all kind of, took my time on the tab one, but we need to know a few things about an accordion panel. We just need to know the title, whether or not it's opened, some of the classes that you want, and if you want to use icons, some of the classes for the icons, like icon open, icon close. So we're going to go through and set some defaults. We're going to get an initial state that basically is just forcing this.props.isOpen to a Boolean, which may not, like, if you pass in a string that says cat, it's going to evaluate to true, but hopefully nobody would do that. There's a toggle function that just changes the state, and so what we care about on the state is whether or not it's opened, and then we're going to render. All right. And because of the way, so if you've ever worked with, if you've ever had to work without a nice abstraction library like jQuery or something in IE, if you guys remember, IE before 9 did not support the class list API. It just had class name, and it was just a space-separated string. It really was a lot of fun to work with, especially if you had to do a lot of adding and removing or toggling of classes. So it was good times had by all. So that's actually that's one thing I don't care for, to be honest with you, with React. That's how the class name works. You just have to give it a space-separated string. So it's an accordion panel. Like, you can't just do, not that I could find. So I mean, and maybe with some updates they're gonna change this. I don't know. But nowhere that I found could you do that really nice ng class where you give it an object with where the key is the class that you want and the value is like the expression. Like, if this is true, it gets this class. So you have to do it all here in your render function, or you could make a helper or whatever. And so we're gonna just do it just a div, and it's gonna have the class name, which is whether we're opened or whether we're accordion panel opened or closed, plus any class name that was passed down on the props. So the important thing is that you always want to make sure, if you think that if you're creating a component and you think a user would want to add custom classes, you can just really easily add those custom classes by adding in this.props.className to the class name that you're giving in the render of your component. And so this is just really simple. I'm just giving it a section that's a header, and it has an H3, and it has an anchor that is going to get the icon classes, and on the click it just does a toggle, and the body is going to have all of the content. So this.props.children. So if you've worked with Angular and you've worked with transclusion, and transclusion is a little bit of a mess in Angular, especially if you have like a lot of scope stuff going on, and it can just get messy. But this is like probably the cleanest way that I've seen to just like add in arbitrary content to a component, because it really just doesn't matter what you have here, because each component should be pretty well self-contained, and you could put whatever you want to in the panel, and it'll just render it. It'll be fine. So that's pretty slick. All right. So any question?
The children are the actual DOM children?
Yeah, absolutely. So we can look real quick. We'll look at, let's see, I think it's the details. Actually, look here. All right. So in one of the loan profile views that I have, it's using that accordion panel, and it's just passing through the props. You can use spread, a spread operator, or maybe it's rest. I don't remember. I think it's a rest operator, where you basically just say, hey, all the properties that were passed into me, pass them onto the panel, and you can give it a key as well, and you pass in to the props like normal. But all this stuff right here, this div with a class name, and then this this field set, and then this other this savings info is actually a totally different chunk of DOM that may or may not be anything, because like this is the savings info is only populated if this information here is true. And so React actually handles, like, if you pass in, like, in between these brackets, these curly braces, if you pass in a null, it'll just be like, okay, this was like obviously something that may or may not actually have content, so I'll just ignore it. And then if you update it and it then has some content, then it'll add it in. So yeah, pretty neat. So this .props.children is going to be, it's actually going to be the div here, and then if savings info is populated, it'll be that div. The deceiving thing about this .props.children is that it won't recursively go through all the children. It's just the first generation children. So if you have something that you like need to propagate down and down and down and down, I think React has some different helpers for that, but so far I didn't really have a use case for that. And I think that, you know, cleverly using like a service abstraction or a mix-in or something like that, you could probably do that a little bit cleaner than just like saying, hey, all my children ever need to know how to do XYZ.
So if you didn't list, I don't know what you call it, inject the children into that other accordion component, then the children that you see here in this screen just wouldn't exist.
Exactly.
They'd be stored in memory somewhere. That's it.
Yep. Yep. They just, yeah, you've got to, I mean, you really kind of think of them as stuff you're passing into the guts of a function, really. I mean, is essentially what's happening. Because when JSX gets converted to JavaScript, like this won't actually be accordion panel. This will be React.create or React.something, like render something, and it'll be like an accordion panel, and then all this stuff here will actually be converted to like React.dom.div, well, field set's a component that I made, but it'll still be the same thing. And so these won't actually be DOM objects like as you see them now. These will all actually just be parameters essentially passed in that become the children. So yeah, you have to, if you have something that's going to wrap some content and put arbitrary content around it, you have to tell it, here's where you stick the content that was given to you in the first place.
Okay.
All right, and so the next thing we'll look at is the form, and this is a big one. And so I'm not going to go through like all of it. I'm going to go even faster than the accordion and hit a couple high points. All right, so JSX or React, everything is a component, and so if you want to have like a specialized form thing, you have to create a class for it, and you have to. It's one thing I like about Angular is that like you don't have to write your own like form thing. You can just like add some attributes to a form that exists and give it new functionality. That's not so with React, and that's again another double-edged sword. It's kind of good in one way because all of the functionality that's on any form, you can kind of go to the class definition and see exactly what it has on it. And the bad thing is that, okay, if you had like one type of form and then another type of form, you either have to write this whole huge class that can handle both, or you have to write two different form classes now, which could be lots of fun. So
you can't mix regular HTML anymore?
well, you can, which you'll see here. I mean, I've got a regular form, but
Like you can't. Well, I guess this would be bound to some DOM element.
yeah, so I'm talking specifically about like validation and stuff. Like if I had a form that that needed to be able to validate itself and all of the fields that are within it. So the way I wanted to write this was that I could put a form anywhere, and it would have a set of fields to use, and those fields would be constructed in a certain way that they would be able to have like a registration type pattern where when a field becomes part of a form, it registers itself and it says, hey form, I'm a field, here's my current validity status, and I'll let you know if my validity changes or anything like that. And so that's really handy if you have a form with fields that are like maybe a cascading dropdown, or maybe if you have like a yes/no question, and then the next 5 questions are based on the answer of that yes/no question up above, right? So it becomes like really instantaneous that the validation changes based on your inputs. And so that's the way that I wanted to write this, and that's why I had to create the class the way that I did. And so we're basically going to, I'll just hit the high parts here. We have a couple functions where you can register a form input and you can deregister, or probably should be unregister. I went with deregister, just reasons, I guess. And so we're going to keep track of our own inputs, and each component should have a name, and we're just tracking them. It's just an object hash of our components. And then when you remove that registration, we're going to delete this .inputs and that component name, and then we're going to call onValidityChanged, because if you remove the registration and it was the only field that was invalid, now our validity for the whole form has changed. There's also a getValue function. So the cool thing about this is that if we use a form on any component and we give it a ref, it can then access the getValue function, and it doesn't need to know about all the inputs that are in it. It doesn't even need to know, really anything. It can just say, hey, whenever I want to be able to get all your values, and it's just going to serialize the form values. We have some validity change events. Here's how we validate the form. We go through all of our inputs, and we call validate form field. Validate form field is going to look and see if our field has a validate function. If it does, it's going to call field.validate. And you can always check if the form is valid, because it's going to go through all of the inputs and see if they're valid. All right, and then submit form. We're going to look and see if we're valid. If we are, we're going to, or if we're not, we're going to just return prevent default. Else, we are going to see if we have an onSubmit property that was passed in, and it's a function. But here's the tricky thing. Because it's a form, and I wanted to build like this kind of really handy form wrapper, I had to handle if you've got a target and you've got a method, like if you've got a target of some URL and the method is get, I don't want to prevent that default. I want to actually just let it execute that. So I had to handle that. And then we're going to call the onSubmit with this .getValue. So it's going to call the submit with the value of the form. And so we have all the other lifecycle events that I think were covered last time. So component will mount, component did mount. We're setting our inputs as just an empty object. And then anytime the component did mount, it's fully mounted, it's fully rendered in the DOM. Do an initial update of validity. That way we can set the validity of our OK and cancel buttons. When we want to go through the children props, we want to be able to tell the children, here's how you register with me. I'm a form, and if you're going to be contained within me, you're going to have to act right? So you're going to have to know how to register. You're going to have to know how to revoke your registration. You're going to have to know how to tell me when your validity changed. And that's how we're going to go through and clone the element with those new properties. And so the render function is going to do essentially what you've seen done before, right? It's going to go through the, first off, it's going to generate some DOM for like a cancel button. So if we have a cancel event, we're going to generate a cancel button. Otherwise, we're not going to. And then we're going to get our clone children. We're going to clone those children with our properties to teach it new tricks, so to speak. And we have just an HTML form. We pass in the clone children. But here's the thing that I wanted to have, that this form wrapper was so good. Now any view just needs to tell my form whether it needs to cancel or not, and then what the onSubmit handler is, and whatever children, whatever inputs you want to pass in, and it'll take care of the rest. So we'll look at one quick form field. Well, that being the case, so again, I found out because of this that the React.props.children was only first generation children. So what I ended up doing was writing another wrapper that would go around each field. So now we have a form, but now we need a wrapper for form field, and this would contain your label, your input, and any error messages. And so this form field also needs to know about validity changing or message or error messages changing. And it'll then propagate the validity changes up to the form. Otherwise, the error status changing, the error population changing, is going to just handle it itself. And it's going to do the same thing though. It's going to update the children props. So it's basically going to propagate down one more level, and it's going to say, okay, I'm getting some properties from my parent, but I need these properties to be passed on to you as well. So we're going to pass in, but also new properties like the valid class, the invalid class, on errors populated. Now here we have on validity change, registering, and deregistering, and those are getting passed down also. And we'll actually show what that looks like, but here's essentially what this has given me. This has given me just a container for the field where I've got a div with a form field label class and a pull left. And I'm just using Bootstrap just for the sake of convenience here. And it's got a label with an HTML4. And then we pass in the children, and then we pass in error messages, which error messages are going to be a list with all of the errors. So it's possible that you have multiple errors. For instance, we could go to a number input, and I'm not going to read through this whole thing because it's fairly complicated. Well, it's fairly long and slightly complicated. But I wrote a couple mix-ins, which we'll look at in just a second. And they remind me of interfaces. Like, they're so much like interfaces. If you've ever worked with language with interfaces like C# or something like that, I actually named them as you would an interface because that's like the only thing that makes sense to me of what these actually are. They're like interfaces with already defined implementations. And so I have a validity change notifier and a registered form input mix-in. And so because of those mix-ins, we will have those methods on ourselves. So let me look for it here. So this dot notify validity changed and notify error populated, those are on here because of the mix-in, because of those mix-ins. So anytime that we have an on change or an on blur, we can validate. And on the change, we're just going to validate the value. But on a blur, we're going to actually pass in a true here, and I'll show you the function in a second. And that's basically going to say, because it's a number input, we may have a minimum value. But if your user is still typing in, you don't want to validate against the minimum value, because like if the minimum value is 5 and they typed a 1, you don't want to tell them, hey, minimum value is 5. Like, they may be typing something else after the 1. So let's see here. Validate. All right, and so I'm just checking here whether we need to check the minimum or not, and we're going to go through and just essentially just parse the whole thing and look to see if it's meeting the requirements, because we can pass in, for a number input, we can pass in a minimum value, a maximum value, a precision, so like how many decimal points should it be allowed to accept. And here's the thing again, when you call set state, that actually, like if I were to call set state with this stuff and then right afterwards call this stuff on a new line, I believe that set state is happening asynchronously. I don't remember if I actually found that in any documentation or anything, but what I noticed was that if I called set state and then right afterwards, like let's say down here on this line, called the notification events, it wouldn't pick up the changes. I had to do it in the callback. And so that was pretty interesting to me, because I was like, what the heck? So it looks like that the set state is actually kind of an asynchronous thing that runs through, and it does all its DOM diffing, because React has like a virtual DOM, and it diffs against the actual DOM to see kind of what's changed. So I had to put it in the callback that I can then notify anybody else that cares to know, like, hey, these things changed. And if there is an on change that was passed in. So here's another cool thing about the way React handles the scoping of things. If you have a form, like you used my form wrapper and then my input field wrapper, and then you used a number input, in some outer scope, if you really, really cared to have the logic of something of when that input's value changes, outside of like what the form automatically does, you can still tap into that, and so that's pretty cool. And React keeps the context of everything correct. Anytime that this component's going to mount, it's going to call its register function. That way it registers itself to the form. And anytime it unmounts, it removes that registration. So that's how we got a form working. And so we'll look at that real quick. So we'll just refresh here. Okay. So it goes directly to the profiles, tells me to click here to create a new one. You notice right off the bat that we have two, and when I blur them, it checks the minimum, but we have two fields that were invalid and other fields that are perfectly valid. So, I mean, let's say we're doing like, let's say we want to buy a new boat, right? And so, like, let's say it's like 10,000. Toys are expensive, so it's like 9.97% interest, and we'll do it over like, not 45, we'll do it over like 5 years. Oh, so interesting thing here, because these fields are related, what I had to do was, even though I had that whole form abstraction where I could just pass in the form fields and say, you know, for this loan term, the minimum is dependent on the dropdown. So I actually had to handle in the like the main view the events for this dropdown and this text box, because they were dependent on each other. But everything else, I just needed to pass in the minimums and the precision. So like, I can't go above 3, I don't know if you can hear my key tapping, but I can't go above 3 decimal places for this, because an interest rate, you really don't. All right, so then we'll submit there, and we can see that we now have just a list of profiles. And here's our accordion panels. And so what's going to happen here is when we make a change, if we pay it off early, we're supposed to have a message here that shows up and says some stuff. So we'll look at that in just 1 second. It's already 6 o'clock. Can I keep going for about like 5 or 10 more minutes, or do I need to wrap up?
Nope.
Okay. Okay, cool. All right, so those are the components, and so now we'll look at some of the things that I didn't like about React. So you're forced to over-componentize, and I kind of made that word up, over-componentization. I don't think it's actually a word, but it is what gets the point across. There are issues with deep objects in a component state, and it may be better than the alternative, though, because like sometimes you see things that are not componentized at all, and it's just like one huge massive thing that really should be broken up. So there's a lot of double-edged swords in React, and this is one of them. Vagueness, how do things update exactly, and what gets updated? And we'll look at an example real quick of that. And I feel like that it's kind of like if you've ever seen this image here of how to draw an owl, a fun and creative guide for beginners. Step 1, draw 2 circles. Step 2, draw the rest of the owl. And that's how a lot of documentation, and it's not just React, so I shouldn't really put this in just React, but as far as like how things update, when things get updated, and stuff like that, that's really how I felt through learning this. And then JSX, there's a lot that I dislike about JSX, and I put a WAT there because I had it in the list that I liked, but it's also in the list that I don't like, just because like you couldn't hand it off to a designer and just be like, hey, you know, can you add in some stuff here? Also, it just seems like that it's a little bit harder, like with class name, it seems like it's more complicated to do dynamic classes. You kind of have to do that in your JavaScript code, and you can't really do like a really nice way like the ng class. I've kind of gotten spoiled on that. And then the main thing that I dislike about React is the lies, all the lies. There's a few claims that they make about performance being so much better than Angular. If you look at any of those demos, they don't use track by, which again, I think Angular really missed a mark whenever whenever they just kind of let you not use TrackBy. I think they should do what React did and say, hey, you really need to use this. Because a lot of people probably didn't even know about, I mean, I didn't know about TrackBy for quite a while, so I'm assuming that a lot of other people are in the same boat. And so that's like the biggest performance boost for repeated objects. And then also there was an article that Dan Wallin posted on Twitter here a couple days ago where somebody actually took the time to do some pretty decent benchmarking against just like native, just using like jQuery and just doing document manipulation that way versus having React do it, and it was actually slower. React was actually quite a bit slower because of all of, like, I guess all the in-memory diffing that it's due. So one quick demo here that I've got about one of the big problems I feel like. I have two profile detail files. I have one that's profile detail and one that's profile detail underscore componentized. Profile detail does this. It has the general panel, which is, let me show you real quick here. It's this, general info. This is the general panel. And on the right side here, if you make changes, there should be, I'll just show you real quick. Here's a form that has cascading fields, and that was like after I wrote the whole set of abstractions on the form. Like once it came to actually building these forms, like cascading fields and all, it was actually crazy easy. So that was pretty nice because it would have sucked to have put all the effort into it, and then like it'd been really hard to make the forms, you know. But let's say that we went to from 2015 August through 2016 and the month of November, we want to add $85 a month as an extra payment. So what's interesting is that here it updated, and so it shows that for all those months we're making $85 extra payment. But nothing is showing up here on the right side, which it's supposed to. It's supposed to show a thing, and I'll show you why that is. And this, when I found this, it blew my mind, and it gave me a big sad because it was terrible. All right, so I have a function here that is called render general panel. I calculate the original months, and I calculate how much we're saving if we've made extra payments. And I'm not going to go through all this because this was it's a little bit beefy to read through. But basically, I'm just calculating, hey, are we saving any time? Are we saving any money? If so, then our savings info is equal to this right here. And it's just JSX, right? It's just going to and I'm also giving it a key. And the reason I added a key was because I found this issue and I thought, oh, it doesn't know that it's updated because it needs a key. I was like, okay, React, I will give you a key for this element. Well, that didn't work, unfortunately, as you just saw. So what we've got is it's got a key here, and I also gave the accordion panel a key. So the accordion panel has all of the normal info plus this savings info right here. And so you see that I've got the normal info just fine. Like it's not got any problem, you know, rendering that part. But I don't believe it updated with like the total interest and stuff. All right. So let's rename this. Let's use the other file. Here's the only difference. The only difference is that here I've abstracted out to another component called general panel. And I'm passing in the profile. And the general panel, I created a service, a profile service that's going to handle, because I'm using local storage to do data persistence. And every time that you modify a profile, it's going to emit an event. And it's just it's like a poor man's event system. It's just a quick subscription thing. It's going to say, hey, a profile was updated, and here's the profile that was updated. So on profile changed is going to be our handler for that, and we're just going to set the state to the profile. And so we're going to subscribe. Let me show you that subscription. So component will mount. I'm calling profile service.onProfile updated, and it's going to just pass in our event handler. And it's a really naive implementation because it assumes that only one profile can be modified at a time, and the profile that's being modified is the one that we're looking at. And that returns a function that, when called, unsubscribes. And it does the same exact logic. Like, literally, this is pasted line for line from the other file. And so let's do a build. Right. All right, so you see here, now I refreshed, and so you can say, okay, that's not really fair, which it isn't. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to then delete that recurring extra payment, and boom, it updates. So if you have an object on your state that has nested properties, and then like 3 properties down the line, that's what you're building part of your UI off of, that does not, for whatever reason, get updated correctly. And so that is a great big sad. All right. So my final thoughts, some things are great. I believe React is definitely worth a look. And the reason I say that is because the way that it forces you to componentize things can make you kind of change your thinking on a couple things and force you to kind of think about things in a little bit more disconnected or modular way. And another thing is that some things like immutable data structures can and probably should be used in other frameworks. There is a library that's on my radar called immutable.js. And so especially if you're working with things where you need to support a lot of undos, like, oh, you make 3 changes and you undo 2, and you make 1 and you undo a couple or whatever. If you use immutable data structures, you don't, for one thing, you don't have to do the angular.copy. So I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where it's like, I've got an item, I need to edit the item, so I pass that item to the scope of like a directive or whatever that's an edit form, but it gets edited and then they cancel and then the edits stay. Well, you got to use angular.copy. You got to copy it somehow, or you have to build some kind of rollback mechanism so that those changes don't stay on the screen, right? Even though they didn't actually change or persist them in your data store. So immutable data structures can be really good. In big green, you see I'm not ditching Angular. I like the learning experience of React. I don't like it enough to change. Hashtag lifer, because I really like Angular. I think it's a lot better. So that's it. Are there any questions? I know there was a lot of content, and I apologize for so much, but I thought a deeper look might be interesting at the very least. So thank you.
Thank you. I don't have a question. I do have comments on React. I'm saving my presentation comments, but general React comments, I agree. I think that it reminds me of Backbone, even though you didn't use any Backbone in there. Like so heavy, complicated JavaScript, and maybe it's because I'm so heavily into Angular that it just made me cringe.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was a lot of code, but granted, he was building a pretty sophisticated interface.
Yeah, it was a more complicated than a to-do app.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of coupling just to get a function from a parent to any arbitrary child.
Yeah, and that's like if you look into React, it won't take long and you'll start seeing things about this whole Flux architecture, which there's more of like a better. So a lot of people apparently realize the same thing, like, man, like this is crazy to try to get things to have like just access to a function. And I didn't want to learn, like I did learn some React Router, which I did show a little bit of, but I didn't want to learn 50 different things just to take a look at React, which it seems like that's the pain point of micro frameworks. It's like, oh yeah, man, just use micro frameworks because it's like it does one thing and it does it well and it's fast and it's small. Great. But now to learn this one thing, to do all the other things I have to do, I have to learn 50 other things just to learn the one thing that you told me to use. And I feel like React is exactly like that because people aren't doing it. This is not how people are building React apps. They're using this Flux architecture with like a messaging pattern, and so like if something were to change, it would just send a message instead of having a reference to a function on its context. But ain't nobody got time for that.
Yeah. It is. It's the Angular is a complete framework, and this is just one piece. So you use other things. At least some degree of that.
And I like that it's opinionated because they have good opinions.
Yeah.
In my
Well, and it's good to have some opinion, and that's the same problem with Backbone. It's like not enough opinion.
Mm-hmm.
So unless you yourself are extremely well opinionated, I guess, and know how to
I don't know any developers like that though.
put things together. I don't know. Yeah.
I had a question about the mix-ins. I was trying to port over the idea of a mix-in in React over to something similar in Angular or another framework. How would you compare?
There really isn't anything similar. So a mixin is just a POHO or a plain old JavaScript object, right? And it's got, you just pass it an object and you give it some functions, and the this is always going to be to the context of the component that's using the mixin. So a mixin, like I don't know of anything in Angular that maybe Angular.extends, I guess. But I actually prefer mixins. I prefer the way mixins look to Angular.extends, and the reason for that is because it's not just like hidden somewhere arbitrary that something is extended by some other item. It is very clear. So like if you look at form field and you want to know, hey, what type of things go into this to give it new functionality, or it's not form field, it's the number input. If you're like, hey, what things are mixed into this, or what things extend this, like you can see at one shot. Here's all the stuff that extends this. I do like that because man, I've seen like one of my first bigger JavaScript apps that I ever worked on was a Backbone app, and it was using, oh my god, it was using Backbone.extend everywhere. And I think that this, like, at the end of the day, I was trying to modify this thing that like I had to go back like 8 or 10 different objects to see where the heck this one method was getting overridden with something that it should have never been overridden with, and it was like, it was a mess. It was a mess.
Okay, so the iValidate or iValidity change notifier, that comes with a set of methods, and those would be, I mean, that's really a singleton that could be reused, so everyone would be sharing the same instance of the iValidate
Exactly.
notifier. Okay.
Exactly.
Well, I think what it is they're actually more decorators. So it's just like you define methods and then those get added onto the object that gets that mix in.
Okay.
And I think they'll probably, in order to bind this, it has to be separate instances, unless inside that you have some shared reference. But yeah, you can do that too.
You could achieve similar thing in Angular, just make each mixed-in service, inject that into your other service. It'd be pretty obvious. Then you'd say, this dot whatever equals this, and you can bind it or do whatever you need to do to specifically mix it into another object. But I think Angular just doesn't really, very often anyway, I don't use like classes and mix and inherit things.
Yeah.
Angular 2 is targeting at fixing that. I think it uses decorators by default to build their stuff. So that could be interesting in the future.
It's wrong. What do they do? It was
Do you know if it would call those methods in the context of the what is this? The number input class?
Yeah, it does. So whenever you reference this in the mixin, it is in the context of whatever component it's being applied to. You have to be careful with the mixins though, because like if I did a mixin and I had I don't know, let's say a component will mount. I was looking through. I was like, well, how would you do this if like you needed something that has a mix-in of like when it will mount, and but you needed to add your own thing. What you'd actually want to do is have it named like component gonna mount or something like that. That way your React lifecycle event on your class would actually be called, because it will overwrite things that are on your class definition.
Okay.
Which I was like, well, that's like not cool.
So I have a question about events in React. Is there a way that you can like create events with like custom behavior? So like in Angular, I believe you can like debounce events and so forth. Is there any built-in way to do that in React?
Well, you would actually, if you had an on-click and you wanted it to only be able to fire once within any certain number of milliseconds, you would actually just have your own debounce function. I mean, that's what Angular does under the what it would do under the hood. Because I know that we've got like services, I guess, or maybe it's directives. I don't remember that would do that. You're eventually just gonna have to implement that yourself. Is kind of what that would boil down to. So you could say on-click, like in your element, you could have an on-click, and your event handler. So this one has an on-change because it's an input, and I could have a debounce in my on-change handler, or some kind of timeout or something. But it's not like baked in to anywhere that I've seen.
Any benefits or drawbacks, maybe compared to Angular for testing? Is it just as easy to test and mock out, shared services, things like that?
I did not do any testing. There is no testing in this app at all, so I can't intelligently answer that. I can say that at least for mixins, you're just using plain old JavaScript objects, so those are easily testable, right?
Right.
Anything else, knowledge of? Sorry.
Kind of cut out there. Still there.
Oh yeah, I just said anything beyond like mixins. I didn't take it that far. I wasn't really interested enough. Like once I got this app working, I was like, okay, I'm done. I didn't really have the interest to go and dig further into, okay, what's the testing story like, and what's the E2E automation and all that. It just didn't retain my interest after that.
Cool.
Okay, any other questions for Bradley?
We need a test subject, somebody who's never used Angular before, to look at this and be like, does this pop and say, wow, that must be all the people who are using it, because everybody else is like, eh. No Angular, whatever.
A lot of the stuff that I read when I was just looking at React, and I didn't go very deep, was you can do all of the same things that you can do in Angular, but there are potentially some performance gains to React. But when I was reading about where they felt Angular fell short, I was like, well, yeah, if you do it that way, it's not going to be as good. So, that kind of
Lies.
yeah, it's
Exactly.
like saying like I don't really believe this, and like I wasn't really sold enough to dig into this. So I'm glad somebody did.
Yeah, I'm a little disappointed with. I got to be honest. I lost a little bit of my faith in humanity during this because there's a lot of lies, like what you just mentioned, and then the big thing that kills me is people are saying, "Oh, but with React, you have to learn to do it the React way," and I'm like, "Well, what the hell do you think I just had to do in this app? I had to learn to do it the React way instead of the Angular way, and I just spent all this time learning how React specifically does it versus and." People in their tutorials are like, oh no, it's just like crazy simple, and it just it's the new hotness because it's it's just JavaScript, and I'm like, yeah, you're kind of lying to yourself and everybody else.
Well, it is Facebook.
They do use PHP.
I mean, they made a language that's literally called hack, which can make more PHP.
Is that? That's from the They made, right?
It's baked into their VM.
Okay, well, there's no other questions for Bradley. We'll stop the broadcast and then move on to the feedback section. So.